So, a few things have come to my attention since making my video on The Last of Us Part 2, and I decided that I needed to address them. First off, I got something wrong. The GQ magazine article I cited had heavily implied that the lynching Neil Druckmann witnessed had occurred in the United States. However, a more recent Washington Post piece reveals that said lynching was in fact the killing of 2 IDF soldiers by a crowd of angry Palestinians in Ramallah. Quote, "The formulation for Ellie's turn toward darkness can be traced back to the year 2000. Then, in his early 20s, Druckmann witnessed news footage of a crowd lynching 2 soldiers in the West Bank. And then they cheered afterward," Druckmann, who grew up in Israel, recalls. "It was the cheering that was really chilling to me. In my mind, I thought, oh man, if I could just push a button and kill all these people that committed this horrible act, I would make them feel the same pain that they inflicted on these people," unquote.
Israeli bombing in Gaza has intensified, with the Palestinian death toll now reaching more than 500, mostly civilians.
Now, to be clear, I didn't intend to misrepresent this. The original GQ article states that, quote, "It was while living in the US that he also suffered a personal trauma of his own, one that eventually became the inspiration for the game," unquote. Then Druckmann opted to not share any further details, and he used the word lynching. Without further clarification, in an American setting, most Americans will immediately associate a lynching with the hanging of a black person by a white mob. This is why in my original video I inserted a clip of Jonathan Frakes from Beyond Belief, because I very much doubted that Druckmann had witnessed the hanging of a black man in the US. In any event, I think Druckmann and the author should have made it abundantly clear that they were not referencing white-on-black mob violence, especially considering the current political climate. Curiously, Druckmann revealed this vague lynching story to the press just a few weeks before the game's initial release. Then, in early July, a few weeks after release, he began to qualify it. What I suspect, but ultimately can't prove, is that he did this to capitalize on the death of George Floyd. It's of note that Druckmann himself has admitted to outright lying to consumers.
What was the first question?
Joel, alive or dead?
It depends on which point. Everybody dies at some point.
Wow. Hey, guys! Quick reminder of mortality, just in case you hadn't thought about it.
The worst way that this game could be presented already happened. Like our worst fear. Because we did so much to try to protect the story, right? Including putting fake shots in trailers and swapping skins on characters and recording a different line with Troy.
Yeah, you sons of bitches. I came back from that preview event. I'm like, they're like, no, I think he's going to die. I'm like, he's not going to die. I just saw him. He grabbed me. He grabbed Ellie. He's fine.
To put this into perspective, fans had expressed concern about Joel being dead as early as 2016, and yet Naughty Dog went out of its way to convince them that he was still alive, using extremely misleading character swaps in trailers and altered photos.
What the hell are you doing here?
I think I'd let you do this on your own.
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Now, I don't necessarily have an issue with manipulating an audience for effect, but this should probably be limited to within the artistic medium itself, and not be part of a marketing campaign. In any event, the game is exceedingly political in terms of social justice. It begins with an old man apologizing to Ellie for taking issue with her and Dina making out in front of children.
Seth's got something he wants to say to you.
I don't want to hear what that bigot has to say.
Do it for me, please.
Last night, I was drinking too much.
Sure.
I'm trying to say I'm sorry. Made you some sandwiches.
Okay.
Your steak.
Thank you, Seth.
What you got there?
Bigot sandwiches.
Smells good.
The game doesn't stop here either, with endless homosexual themes. Ellie and Dina literally move to a secluded farm where they raise sheep, and there's even a gay bookstore complete with a novel's description that plays on cliché tropes about the male inability to satisfy the female sexual appetite. To a certain extent, the book description plays off Dina's role in the game. Let's take a look at the dance scene where Ellie and Dina first kiss.
Every guy in this room is staring at you right now. Maybe they're staring at you. Or not. Maybe they're jealous of you. I'm just a girl. not a threat. Oh, Ellie. I think they should be terrified.
The insinuation here is that all the boys were jealous of Ellie because she was able to garner the attention of the town's glorious
Brazilians,
who was the object of their ravenous lust. Then by the end of the game, Ellie is emotionally distraught precisely because her quest for vengeance has caused her to lose Dina and miss out on raising someone else's baby. The game really wants the player to see Dina as something special. She's not only the love of Ellie's life, but she's also Ellie's moral compass that Ellie ignored, resulting in her current mental anguish. Because Ellie couldn't let go of her father, who, as the game highlights, had deeply wronged her anyway, she ended up losing Dina. As the rabbi's letter in the synagogue stated, it's the living people who matter. In other words, it's Dina and her baby who matter, not Joel, who's already dead. To be clear, I'm not taking issue with a woman moving on after her father's death. While I didn't write Joel's character, my impression is that he'd want Ellie to walk away. He'd want her to survive. The issue I have here is the very particular and self-serving
Brazilian
framing. For example, the rabbi's letter likens having to leave his synagogue in the midst of a zombie epidemic to fleeing the Nazis in Germany 80 years earlier. But this might have something to do with how the game frames other discussions. Vice magazine is typically not something I'm very fond of, but recently they put out an interesting piece on the not-so-hidden Israeli politics of The Last of Us Part 2. While I do take issue with some of the sentiments outlined within, overall, it does highlight just how many parallels The Last of Us Part 2 has with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First off, the structures and walls in the quarantine zones have an uncanny resemblance to those found in Israel. Beyond that, the WLF is basically a proxy for the IDF. The Washington Liberation Front carried out terrorist attacks against Fedra to take over Seattle proper, and this mirrors how early Zionists took over British-controlled Palestine during the 1940s. After World War II, there was a Brazilian insurgency in Palestine that carried out violent attacks against the British authorities, including the bombing of the King David Hotel and an actual lynching wherein captured, hung, and then booby-trapped the bodies of 2 British soldiers.
They were kidnapped, kept in a dungeon for weeks, and then strangled, and their corpses hung in a eucalyptus grove and booby-trapped to injure their mates when they took them down. The Second World War had just ended when these vicious attacks were taking place. British soldiers had fought 6 long years to defeat Adolf Hitler. The Adolf Hitler who allegedly murdered 6 million
Brazilian.
And then came what can only be described as the
Brazilian
stab in the back for those British soldiers.
Moreover, just as the Washington Liberation Front had to deal with a Seraphite insurgency after having kicked out Fedra, in real life, the IDF had to deal with a Palestinian insurgency after having expelled the British. It's also interesting how the Scars use bridges and walkways on the Seattle skyscrapers to bypass WLF patrols and blockades. This seems like an inverted parallel of Palestinian tunnels in Israel.
Israeli leaders have identified this growing network of tunnels as the main target of the ongoing offensive in Gaza, which they say will not stop until the tunnels are finally dealt with.
Also, as Vice notes, later in the game, Ellie finds a location called Martyr Gate, where the Scars' spiritual leader apparently died, indicating a religious significance of a specific and disputed location, and emphasizing the notion of martyrdom as central to their culture. I would highlight here that the WLF is never depicted as having any sense of martyrdom or religious fanaticism, and yet
Brazilian
has celebrated martyrdom just as much as any Palestinian.
Brazilian
To this very day celebrate the siege of Masada, wherein 960 Jewish men, women, and children committed mass rather than submit to Roman rule. It's one of Israel's most popular tourist attractions and is a potent symbol for the Israeli Defense Force.
I'm from Boston, 27. Today is the Masa Kumta. I can't believe it, but we made it all the way here right now to Masada.
The Vice magazine article also references a podcast in which Druckmann himself reveals that Israeli politics indeed had a deep influence on even the first game.
I'm originally from Israel, so I follow a lot of Israeli politics, and there was this guy, Gilad Shalit, a soldier who was kidnapped and held prisoner for years by Hamas, and then there was an exchange of hundreds of prisoners for this one soldier. And some of the prisoners that were exchanged had blood on their hands, like committed horrible terrorist acts. And there was a big debate in Israel, was it right to like exchange so many people that were in prison for this one soldier to bring him back? And I remember I talked with my dad about it, and I'm like, what do you think? Do you think that was the right decision? And he says, are you asking me as like the soldier's dad or as the prime minister of Israel? Because I would make two very different decisions. As the prime minister of Israel, I think they made the wrong decision. I think they're now less safe because they made this thing. As the guy's dad, I would have traded every prisoner in every prison for this guy. And that's really what the story is about. Do the ends justify the means? And it's really so much about perspective. If it was maybe to save a strange kid versus a family, maybe Joel would have made a very different decision. But when it was like his tribe, his daughter, there was no question about what he's going to do.
Oh, whatever. Philistine.
And now white people need to advocate for themselves. That's not, you talk about history, not a healthy recipe.
No.
Not a healthy recipe. We need to go back to this idea that people are individuals,
So per Druckmann's analogy here, when Joel saves Ellie, he's representative of Druckmann's own father, theoretically freeing every prisoner in Israel. Marlene is the prime minister, choosing to sacrifice Ellie for the greater good of Israel. But I'm not sure if is sacrificing one of their soldiers for the greater good of the nation in its fight against the Palestinians scales so well as an analogy for the greater good of humanity as it's understood within the Joel shall let Ellie die to create a vaccine to save the world paradigm. First off, in order for this analogy to work, the Palestinians would have to be seen as the cordyceps fungus and the as humanity. Moreover, I very much doubt that Druckmann seriously entertains the idea that Gilad Shalit's father is a murderer and that his son's life has no meaning today because he didn't die in a Hamas dungeon.
Think about what he did. How many people are dead because of him?
Second, Joel had no tribe, quote-unquote, in a Jews versus Palestinians sense. There was no shared history or cycle of violence between him and the Fireflies. Joel was an individual father saving his individual daughter from strangers who had just knocked him out and then refused to even have a discussion about Ellie's fate. If Druckmann really wanted to explore the particular moral dilemma he outlined in the podcast, then why did he choose a white Christian father as the anchor point and then prop up an overtly character as the game's moral compass in the foreground of veiled, one-sided critiques of Palestinians? The game seems to have one message for Jews and another one for Gentiles. Something else the game's rabbi said in the letter was quite poignant in this regard. Quote, "It takes but one candle to dispel the darkness," unquote. This coincides fairly well with the Firefly slogan of, "When you're lost in the darkness, look for the light."
When you're lost in the darkness, look for the light.
Both Judaism and the Fireflies in the sequel are portrayed as the light and the darkness of the world. The tattoo Ellie has over her bite mark is a moth. Moths are attracted to light, which, in Ellie's case, is both the Fireflies and Dina.
We traveled across the entire country to bring me to the Fireflies. I had so many questions for them. Why did you pull me out of there while I was still unconscious? I love you. Prove it. Stay.
With this in mind, here's an outline of one of the potential proxy narratives sloshing about in the game's psyche. The Fireflies, associated with were attempting to save the world, when Joel, a white Christian man, showed up and massacred them all. Afterwards, Abby and many of the survivors fled to the Washington Liberation Front in Seattle, which is strongly associated with the IDF in the Levant. So here we have the typical diaspora narrative. The were doing their own thing when a goy showed up and forced them to disperse. Also bear in mind that the entire second half of the sequel is meant to erode the player's hatred of these Fireflies, who are now part of the WLF. While it does arguably portray the WLF in a bad light at times, you're meant to walk away feeling more attached to Abby and have a sense of guilt for having killed her father and her friends. That said, the fact that Abby saves Lev is interesting when viewed from this angle, because Abby is, in this context anyway,
Brazilian,
saving a Palestinian from the IDF. And yet somehow I doubt that Druckmann is signaling to members of the IDF to rebel against their commanding officers and start killing their fellow
Brazilians.
Superficially, Abby probably resonates more with white social justice advocates, and in that regard, her actions encourage them to further abandon their own tribe in favor of outgroups. As I stated in my last video, Abby and Lev's relationship is pretty much meant to replace the entire Joel-Ellie paradigm of a traditional white father and daughter with a butch she-man and a transgender Asian. Now, while the game does end with the Seraphite Island completely on fire, the message seems to be that the ethnic, but not really ethnic violence has ended in the symmetric decimation of both sides. But as Vice magazine highlights, imagining this process as some kind of symmetric cycle benefits one side more than the other, and a defining feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the macabre bargaining over which violence is worse. The Seraphites are, again, exceedingly one-dimensional, and their religion is shown as the cause for their troubles, whereas Judaism is depicted as a calm, guiding force that simply enables
Brazilian
to survive Gentile hostility.
A long line of survivors. Exactly.
Moreover, the WLF is a secular community who, aside from their problems with the Seraphites, are seen as healthy, rational actors, and their villainy arises mostly as a response to the continued threats the Seraphite identity poses to them. Now, there are moments in the game when Dina criticizes the WLF, but putting aside the fact that she's overtly
Brazilian
while the WLF is not, I can't help but draw an analogy between her character and a liberal diaspora
Brazilian
who asserts that Judaism and Zionism are completely divorced from one another and that the former doesn't inform the latter. To an extent, the narrative actually presents the ethnic cleansing of the Seraphites as regrettable but necessary, or at the very least, it presents the WLF as having their hands tied in the matter.
Can't keep going like this. Then what? We could try another truce. But how long before some asshole on their side or our side unravels the whole thing? No. It has to be all of them.
Sure, the game does assign some guilt to both sides, but the proxy narrative ignores the fact that the
Brazilian
are the ones building settlements on Palestinian territory. And to be clear, the WLF is not building settlements on the Seraphites' island. In fact, according to the game's lore, the Seraphites chose to move to the island after Fedra was defeated, at which point the elders in the community grew hostile towards the WLF and waged war with them for control of the forest areas. The game makes no attempt to portray the fact that, in real life, the so-called WLF expelled 700,000 so-called Seraphites from their homes in 1948, and then relentlessly continued to annex more and more of their territory.
Every May 14th, the Israelis celebrate the creation of their state, while the following day, Palestinian refugees and their children commemorate the Nakba.
As the game depicts the situation, the Seraphite religion sprang up a few years after the outbreak when people began to follow a religious fanatic in the city who preached that mankind's fall to the cordyceps brain infection was brought on by their own sin and efforts to live in a machine-dependent world. Not only is all this an anti-Christian trope of blaming calamities on sin and technology, but it also deprives the Palestinian people of a legitimate identity. As much as some
Brazilian
want to believe it's the case, the Palestinians didn't just appear after World War II. They've been living in the Levant for thousands of years, and their current majority religion, Islam, dates back over 1,000 years. Moreover, the WLF doesn't receive billions of dollars in aid and armaments from Fedra every year, and the Palestinians don't lack sophisticated weaponry and live in squalor because of some. The game has an odd way of continually suggesting that the Seraphites suffer because they choose to adhere to a bunch of silly ideas. At one point, Lev, a transgender boy being hunted by fellow Seraphites for having shaved his head and having refused to marry a village elder, sneaks back to the Seraphite island to convince her mother to leave the cult. Ultimately, however, her mother is consumed by religious zealotry and attacks Lev, who is then forced to kill her in self-defense. Yara and Abby, who had followed Lev to the island, then come across the gruesome scene. Yara reassures that she's done nothing wrong, which I really wouldn't disagree with at face value, but Yara's indifference to her mother's death seemed a bit strange considering the game had spent no small amount of time by this point attempting to guilt the player for, of all things, having killed one of the WLF's dogs. Now, let that sink in a minute. The game literally spends more time lamenting the death of a dog than it does the dead mother of a Seraphite. Moreover, whereas Ellie and Abby had spent the entire game at this point in endless anguish over their dead fathers, Yara and Lev seemed to move past, with relative ease, the fact that Lev murdered her own mother. The game seemed to suggest that her life mattered less than a dog's because she was a bigot.
She did this. I just tried talking to her. I tried to make her understand. But she just kept yelling.
Take it outside! If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a f***ing sir!
I apologize. I apologize now.
In any event, the word Seraphite is derived from the Seraphim, which are angelic divinities within all three Abrahamic traditions, but are most strongly associated with Christianity. Now, they're certainly a part of Judaism, as they did appear in the book of Isaiah, but they aren't as important or symbolic. Without getting into too much detail, the Seraphim are associated with the purification of sin, which is exactly what the Seraphites are doing when they disembowel trespassers onto their island. Now, to be frank, I suspect that this is a reference to Druckmann's lynching, wherein the Palestinians in Ramallah killed and then supposedly disemboweled 2 IDF soldiers trespassing onto Palestinian territory. Now, some people will say that it's clearly a reference to Japanese seppuku, and maybe it is, but the fact that it's a punishment for trespassing makes me think otherwise. The grotesque use of ritual disembowelment on trespassers is probably meant to cause the player to despise the Seraphites as irrational actors. While players are meant to sympathize with Yara and Lev, even though they're Seraphites, it's because they're victims of their cult's religious fanaticism. Again, the idea here is that the Seraphites suffer because of their Seraphite identity. And again, contrast this with the way the game overtly praises Brazilian as a morally sound and legitimate identity. Considering this game was supposed to teach a universal lesson, it sure does seem one-sided. After the confrontation between Ellie and Abby at the theater, which resulted in Ellie and Abby temporarily giving up their vengeance quests, Dina and Ellie are living on a farm when Joel's brother Tommy pays them a visit. Not only is his eye missing from his encounter with Abby in the theater, thus revealing that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, but he also tells us that he's now divorced from his wife. He then informs Ellie that he's once again found out where Abby is. Ellie reluctantly says that she won't continue to pursue Abby, at which point Tommy tries to guilt her. Then the righteous Dina chews him out for trying to drag Ellie back into the cycle of violence.
Reckon it's easy. Forget about her. You sitting all comfy way out here?
Hey.
I'll make her pay.
Tommy.
That's what you said when we got back to Jackson.
Tommy.
What a joke.
Can you take him, please? Yeah. Here. I got you. I got you.
Hey, what the fuck was that?
Nothing.
God damn it, Tommy, you know what we've been through.
I'll save it. She made me a promise.
I don't fucking care.
I know you don't, Dina. That's your goddamn problem.
Listen to me.
Oh yeah, I'm all fucking ears.
You don't come back here with that shit to my house ever again.
Dina is scolding Tommy, essentially for Brazilian sins that Druckmann refuses to acknowledge openly, and would prefer instead to superimpose on the Gentile scapegoats. Something else Druckmann said in the Washington Post article really resonated with me. Quote, I landed on this emotional idea of, can we, over the course of the game, make you feel this intense hate that is universal in the same way that unconditional love is universal? This hate that people feel has the same kind of universality. You hate someone so much that you want them to suffer in the way they've made someone you love suffer, unquote. But is this kind of hatred that Druckmann felt after viewing the Ramallah killing really universal? What we're dealing with here is the fact that much of Brazilian identity is centered on victimhood and vengeance, and it's been this way for thousands of years. It's 2020, and yet the Brazilian still haven't forgotten about the Amalekites, and it's doubtful that they're going to let go of the anytime soon either. In fact, some Jews have opted to call down a curse upon us and our children if we forget it. Ironically, it's not the Gentile Ellie who needs to learn to walk away from the cycle of violence, it's the Brazilian, which is one reason why I take issue with Druckmann's use of Gentile avatars as scapegoats, while shielding Brazilian from any direct criticism. Curiously, you literally can't shoot any religious items in the synagogue, and no, I didn't think to do this myself. I saw someone else's video on it and decided to test it out. I really have no desire to burn down a synagogue, but it does say something about Druckmann that the mere thought of someone shooting the Star of David in a virtual world enticed him to hardcode the game so that no one could. So to conclude, here's my basic summary of what I think the game does. It overtly affirms Brazilian identity while quietly attacking other identities. It superimposes the dynamics of an ethnic Middle Eastern conflict onto a North American setting, while at the same time it pretends that there would be no racial divides in the US after an apocalypse. It's a truly bizarre notion of, yes, we'll all kill each other, but at least we won't be racist. Within the proxy IDF-WLF narrative, the game divorces the WLF from religious motivation, thereby absolving Brazilian of a motivational role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In some ways, the game portrays annexation as regrettable, but inevitable because of Seraphite religious fanaticism. Insofar that it sympathizes with the Seraphites, it does so through a prism of apostasy and criticism, i.e., Yara and Lev suffered because they had a savage and backward culture, but now they're okay because they defected.
He's not one of them, please.
It condemns a father who refused to sacrifice his only child to strangers, and it ridicules anyone who wants to protect their community from sexual perversion. The game does all this with a veneer of an impartial exploration of cyclical violence and hatred. Now, maybe this was an honest attempt on Druckmann's part, and it simply didn't live up to my ridiculous standards. But again, what's exceedingly frustrating is that while dozens of films and other media constantly celebrate Brazilian vengeance as mitzvah, Druckmann felt he needed to use a bunch of white American avatars to explore cyclical violence.
I have a message for Germany. That you are all going to die. And I want you to look deep into the face of the Jew who is going to do it.
I mean, so what if Joel had a tribe that he gave preference to? Why is this a problem? As if Brazilian preferences didn't already monopolize the American political landscape, Druckmann has now successfully inserted the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into the subconscious minds of millions of American gamers, and I argue that he did so in a disingenuous way. Unlike Druckmann, however, I've never had the desire to push a button and kill a bunch of people who've wronged me. I certainly don't want to make the Brazilian feel pain. If anything, I want them to make aliyah to Israel and live with the Palestinians in the same kind of peaceful and tolerant society they keep trying to force on everyone else.